so awesome!
What if your favorite Disney movie didn't exist? Or rather, what if they existed in an entirely different version? That's the question we're asking today as we dive into some unused alternate Disney storylines from some of their most beloved franchises. From the vengeful Snow Queen in Frozen to an entirely different pitch for Monsters, Inc., these movies will only exist on paper, or maybe in an alternate reality. Coming in first, we have to talk about the iconic legend that is The Lion King. No, not that one. Yeah, that's better. Released in 1993, this film ranks as one of the studio's best films from the era known as the Renaissance. But the film almost turned out quite differently thanks to a very different part of the story that was included in the original script. As we all remember, because it was so emotionally scarring to our younger minds, Scar straight up tosses Mufasa into the stampede.
Long live the king.
And scare Simba into exile. But this wasn't in the original version of the movie. Instead, and brace yourself for this one, Scar was actually going to adopt Simba and raise him as his own son. Yeah, mind blown. Basically, Scar was going to remove Simba from the equation at the same time as Mufasa, but the rest of the pride came down to the gorge upon seeing the dust in the air. They found Scar with Simba in his mouth and assumed wrongly that Scar had saved the young prince, forcing his uncle to take charge of raising the boy, who would grow up to be a lovable goof. But all that was changed in favor of a more heroic story. Speaking of evil family members, let's talk about what could have been with Frozen. Sure, this wouldn't have sat well with kids per se, but on paper, this would have been a very bold story for Disney to tell. You may not know it, but Frozen is actually heavily inspired by the fairy tale that is the Snow Queen. In it, the Snow Queen is actually an evil being, and Frozen was going to follow this inspiration when it came time to tell its story. Anna and Elsa were not originally written as sisters, despite that being a huge part of the final cut of the movie. Anna was instead a poor peasant who sought out the Snow Queen, the only person who can freeze her unbroken heart. Yeah, dramatic much. Elsa had experience in this task as she did it to herself once after she was left at the altar on her wedding day. By the end of the movie, Anna and Elsa would have clashed in an epic battle, complete with armies of snow monsters. But as soon as Let It Go was written, the whole movie got a shake-up to make the song work better with the movie. So yeah, more reasons to blame that wretched song. Moving on from the snow and cold of Frozen, let's see what's happening in the bustling metropolis known as Zootopia. That original movie was a huge hit and felt very self-aware as well, but that entire movie was not the original direction the studio was going with. The studio saw something great in the character that was Nick Wilde.
And I'm not the liar. He is.
So it should come as no surprise that the original version of the movie had him as the protagonist as opposed to Judy Hopps. In this version, predators are considered a menace to society and have to wear collars that keep them from trying to snack on the other animals in the city. Every time a predator gets too angry or aggressive, they would get a shock. When Nick goes to visit his doctor, who naturally has to take the collar off for the checkup, Nick ends up feeling a tremendous amount of freedom from the sensation. With this epiphany, Nick decides to open up and run an illegal amusement park called Wild Times, a refuge for all the predators to hang out and be free without their collars. Yeah, Disney, you have this script. Make this a prequel or a sequel, now, please. Now, this next entry comes courtesy of one of the most favorite Pixar films, Monsters, Inc. In order to power the world of monsters, many of these creepy beings work at the Scare Factory, where children's screams of terror are converted into electricity to power the town. But all that changes when the factory's chief scarer comes into contact with a child.
Bucket.
But none of this was in the original pitch for the movie. Instead, we were going to follow a 30-something-year-old human man. This particular fellow was still haunted by the monsters under his bed from his childhood. What's even more interesting, in typical Pixar fashion, is that each one of these monsters actually represented some sort of personal trauma the man had encountered in his life. In order to make the monsters go away once and for all, the man was going to have to confront these monsters as opposed to being scared by them. Would you want Pixar to eventually explore this idea as an original script, or is the current version of Monsters, Inc. the definitive version for you? Hey, let us know. Now, if you want something a little weird, we got you covered, because we're going to be talking about Alice in Wonderland. Things get a little bizarre in Wonderland, which is the whole point, of course. Only, what if it wasn't? This movie adaptation of Alice in Wonderland was written by Aldous Huxley, the guy who wrote Brave New World. Titled Alice and the Mysterious Mr. Carroll, the movie follows the real-life author of Alice in Wonderland, Lewis Carroll, and a real-life version of Alice. The duo are basically done with people trying to tell them how to live their lives, and so they decide to ditch conventional society. The film was to be a mix between live-action and animated sequences, likely seeing the trippier stuff become realized in animation. Ultimately, Disney decided that this version of Alice was too literary. This was back in the 1940s, and yet, despite how innovative this script sounds, the studio has elected not to make it, but has made 2 live-action versions with Johnny Depp and Tim Burton. Yeah, I know. Now, I mentioned how Monsters, Inc. is one of my favorite Pixar movies, but my all-time favorite is the first Toy Story movie. What a treasure. But that's the version I actually own. The original pitch for the movie, well, let's just say that I don't think I'd like it that much. So, in the original Toy Story, Woody was a bit of a jerk, right? He was jealous, controlling, and angry.
You are a child's plaything!
But we still liked him enough to root for him because he was so pure and passionate. But in the original script, oh boy, he basically treated Slinky as his own personal slave for starters, and often bullied the other toys into doing what he wanted to do. When it came time to get rid of Buzz in the original movie, things got out of hand and Mr. Lightyear went flying out of the window by accident. Not so in the original cut, where Woody willingly tosses him out of the window. This causes the rest of the toys to snap and openly revolt against Woody's tyrannical rule. Talk about one dark and brutal movie there, Pixar. And that was their first feature too. I don't think Disney would have sold many toys if this was made. Now, I mentioned a Brave New World before, but this alternate version of Brave would not have been that. What made Brave so great was its commitment to the portrayal of Scottish culture. This movie is otherwise fine, but it had a bit of a personality in the world and characters. But yeah, all of that was totally not in the original version. In fact, the location in question was going to be a generic nameless place instead. The script described the world of Brave as a nameless Northern European country, but never committed to any bit of culture that defined the world. So it would have had castles and swords more than likely, but it would have been far more bland instead. Not only that, but the original script actually had a romantic subplot for Merida with young MacGuffin. Part of Brave's charm was that it didn't rely on romantic tropes established in, well, every Disney princess movie ever. So if Brave came out with no identity and had to go through the whole romance thing as well, we don't think the movie would have resonated as well with audiences as it did. Wreck-It Ralph was a smash hit, huh? Yeah, okay, sorry, couldn't resist that one. Anyway, part of what made that movie so charming and fun to watch was the plethora of pop culture references littered throughout the world Ralph inhabited. From Nintendo to Street Fighter and Metal Gear Solid, among dozens of others, there was always something to find. But an indirect reference to one of the biggest games ever was scrapped entirely from the final cut of the movie. After Ralph wrecks Vanellope's kart racer, she flees Sugar Rush and seeks out a place where he can distract himself from all the pains of the world. He finds himself in a fourth world called Extreme Easy Living 2. Director Rich Moore likened the location to the popular game The Sims. Ralph would essentially drown his sorrows in superficial happiness with strangers and drink, which we're going to assume is root beer. Seeing as this is an entire world, Ralph would have likely spent more than a few seconds here, but the scenes threw off the entire pace of the movie and made the plot feel more convoluted, so it was scrapped entirely. Since Ralph was all about nostalgia video games, we have to wonder if Rapunzel would have played Wreck-It Ralph in the original version of Tangled. We know that movie is a retelling of Rapunzel, complete with long hair and a tower, but also introducing new story elements, songs, and memorable characters. This was almost not the case if one of the original pitches was greenlit. In fact, the original pitch saw our leading heroine living in modern-day San Francisco. Despite being in the modern, trivial, and magicless reality that we're all familiar with, she gets transported into the fairy tale land and becomes Rapunzel. How she got there remains unknown. Now, I like Tangled as much as the next person, but I think there's also something here that could be interesting in the future. Maybe not Rapunzel, as that could get repetitive in a way, but seeing a modern, perhaps technology-obsessed heroine get plunged into a fairy tale and face social challenges of the time would be an interesting Disney story to tell. There was also another version of Tangled in the works called Rapunzel Unbridled, which the director of that project likened to Shrek. Last but not least, let's wrap things up with the feels trip that was Toy Story 3. If you didn't feel all misty-eyed by the end of that movie, especially as someone who grew up with the trilogy, well then you're likely a robot. But the dramatic ending may not have had the same impact if this version of the movie played out. In the original cut, Andy is heading off to college and opts to bring Woody with him. The rest of the toys were to be stashed in the attic but were accidentally donated to the daycare instead, which is where most of the plot takes place. But in this cut, the toys stayed in the dark and dusty attic, but not Andy's attic, his grandmother's. Here, they would have found a bunch of unused, forgotten, and creepy toys and an angry garden gnome. On top of that, the toys would have to solve some sort of mystery, Knives Out style. While many of the initial points set up would be used in the theatrical cut, the daycare story offered more character moments, whereas the attic plot lines feel like a TV special. If they wanted to make a TV special though, I'd still watch it. And those are some of the best or weirdest alternate Disney storylines that were never told. Which one of these do you think has potential? And do you think any of them could have been better than the final version we all saw? Let us know in the comments below. And be sure to hit that subscribe button to get all the latest from Screen Rant every day. Thanks for watching.